It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and waved to each other from across the cul-de-sac. Redding, California, nestled in the scenic northern part of the state, was a picture of suburban tranquility, a town of tree-lined streets, little league games, and neighbors who knew your dog's name. It was, in many ways, the American dream. Sherri Papini fit right in. Petite and blonde with an almost childlike voice, she had the smile of someone who seemed perpetually upbeat. To those who knew her, she was the ideal suburban mom, devoted to her two young children, fiercely protective of her family, and often spotted at school pickups, PTA meetings, and church functions. Her husband, Keith Papini, worked in a local Best Buy and was known as a quiet, dependable type, the kind of man who built treehouses in his backyard and grilled steaks on weekends. Their home, tucked at the edge of the city, was the picture of stability. The Papinis looked like the couple everyone wanted to be, young, attractive, in love. On social media, Sherri posted pictures of family outings, holiday crafts, and handwritten notes of affection to her children. To anyone scrolling through her life, she was a hands-on mom and a happy wife. But sometimes, the stories we tell the world aren't the ones we live behind closed doors. It was the kind of quiet illusion that made what happened next all the more horrifying. On the morning of November 2nd, 2016, the world shifted. Sherri kissed her husband goodbye as he left for work, a routine so ordinary it didn't warrant a second thought. The children were at daycare. It was the kind of clear, crisp morning that called for a jog. And that's exactly what Sherri told herself she'd do. She laced up her running shoes, tied her hair back into a ponytail, and stepped out into the California sun, completely unaware, or perhaps fully aware, of the chaos she was about to ignite. Hours later, Keith returned home to an empty house. At first, he wasn't worried. Sherri often jogged in the late mornings, and it wasn't uncommon for her to run a few errands or visit her mom. But as the hours ticked by, unease crept in. He called, texted, no answer. By early evening, panic bloomed into fear. Keith used Apple's Find My iPhone feature and tracked Sherri's phone to a spot along Old Oregon Trail, a rural stretch north of town. When he arrived, the scene was chilling. There on the roadside lay Sherri's phone, earbuds still tangled, her favorite running playlist frozen mid-track. A few strands of her blonde hair were twisted into the cord, as if yanked violently. There was no sign of her, no note, no trail, just silence. Keith called 911. As the dispatcher's voice crackled through the line, he choked on words that felt impossible to speak. My wife is missing. The Redding Police Department responded quickly. A missing woman. Phone abandoned. Signs of possible struggle. It didn't take long before the case escalated. Sherri Papini, age 34, was officially listed as missing by that evening. Keith was inconsolable. In the hours that followed, officers questioned him repeatedly. Where had he been that day? Had they fought? Did she have any mental health issues? Keith answered everything without hesitation. No arguments, no stress, no reason for her to run off. He even took a polygraph test. Passed. His heartbreak was genuine, his desperation raw. And then there was the phone, a chilling centerpiece in the growing mystery. Investigators noted how strange it was. Why would a kidnapper leave the victim's phone so neatly placed? Why just a few strands of hair? No signs of blood, no drag marks, no obvious struggle. But for now, the evidence pointed to the worst. Sherri had vanished and foul play was likely. By the next day, flyers with Sherri's face blanketed every storefront in Shasta County. Blonde hair, hazel eyes, 5'3". The media latched on fast. A beautiful young mother disappearing without a trace. It was a headline made for cable news. Networks like CNN, Fox News, and local affiliates ran with the story. Sherri's face was everywhere, and Keith, reeling from fear and confusion, stepped into the role of grieving husband on a national stage. "Bring her home," he pleaded, tears staining his cheeks as cameras rolled. "Whoever has her, please let her go. She's a good person. She's a good mom." The public responded with urgency and empathy. Volunteers combed nearby trails, creeks, and wooded areas. Helicopters flew overhead. A $50,000 reward was posted. Strangers offered tips, sightings, anything. But nothing materialized. Not a footprint, not a witness, not a clue, just silence. Each day that passed made hope harder to hold on to. Behind closed doors, the FBI joined the case. They began building a profile not just of a potential abductor but of Sherri herself. Who was she, really? Had she been in danger? Was someone following her? Or could there be something deeper, something no one wanted to consider? And still, no one knew what had happened during those hours after she left home. Until a moment of eerie coincidence. A traffic camera along a rural highway had picked up a white SUV moving slowly near Old Oregon Trail around the time Sherri disappeared. No license plate, no face visible. Just a vague shape. Could it be connected? Investigators dug deeper, collecting security footage, bank records, and cell phone tower pings. They examined Sherri's laptop, searched her emails, and dug into her social media. Still, there was nothing to suggest she had planned to leave. And Keith insisted again and again. She wouldn't leave the kids, not willingly. As the days turned into weeks, suspicion swirled. Armchair detectives online speculated about Keith. Was he too emotional? Too rehearsed? The Scott Peterson comparisons began, an unfair echo from a case long past, but one that often haunts husbands of missing women. Police maintained he was not a suspect. But still, the silence spoke louder than anything. 22 days. That's how long Sherri Papini was gone. Then, just like that, she came back. Thanksgiving morning, 2016. The quiet hum of holiday anticipation filled most homes in Northern California. Families were prepping turkeys, children glued to the Macy's parade. But in one home, in one kitchen, the phone rang and changed everything. The voice on the other end was almost surreal. A driver, startled and shaken, reported seeing a disoriented woman on the side of a rural road near Interstate 5, over 150 miles south of where Sherri Papini had vanished. The woman was battered, barely coherent, covered in bruises and filth. She had a chain wrapped around her waist. Her nose was swollen, her body emaciated. She was branded. It was Sherri. Police and medics arrived quickly. She could barely speak, crying uncontrollably, hyperventilating between words. She had lost over 15 pounds and had bruises in various stages of healing. Her once blonde hair was chopped short. Her wrists were marked with ligature injuries. There were bindings, consistent with what she later claimed had been restraints. She said she'd been abducted by 2 Hispanic women, who had taken her at gunpoint, held her captive in a small room, and hurt her repeatedly. Their faces, she said, were always covered. One was older, the other younger. They didn't speak much. She didn't know why she was taken. And then, inexplicably, they let her go. Dropped her on the side of a freeway. Left her like garbage. When Keith got the call, he collapsed in sobs. The nightmare was over, or so he thought. He rushed to the hospital to see his wife, expecting to find comfort in her arms. But what he saw was something else entirely. Sherri was a shell of herself. She clung to him, trembling, her voice hoarse from screaming. She refused to be touched by anyone else. Police, nurses, even family. Keith would later say that she would jump at every sound, and that her trauma was too severe for words. The headlines exploded. Sherri Papini found alive, branded, starved, and released. Kidnap mystery deepens. California MOM escapes captors after 22 days. The nation was captivated. Talk shows speculated endlessly. True crime forums lit up with theories. What kind of monsters would do this? Where were the suspects? Would there be justice? But behind the scenes, investigators were uneasy. Yes, Sherri had returned. Yes, her injuries were real. But something about her story didn't sit right. The details were vague, inconsistent. She claimed not to have seen her captors' faces, yet described them down to their eyebrow shapes. She recalled being chained, but there were no raw or infected marks. She mentioned being burned, but doctors found no signs of significant burns. She also claimed she had no idea where she had been, yet described features of the place where she was held. A closet, a boarded-up window, Spanish music playing. She also said she'd been branded. A bizarre and disturbing claim. On her right shoulder was a crude symbol burned into her skin. She wouldn't say what it was, only that it was meant to humiliate her. The FBI sent it to gang experts. They found no known connection to any gang or cartel. Still, the public believed her. Why wouldn't they? The trauma was visible. The pain seemed real. Keith, again, stood before the cameras, holding his wife's hand, tears in his eyes. "I got my wife back," he whispered, but not the same version of her that left. As media hailed her miraculous return, law enforcement began building a different kind of case. One that didn't involve masked kidnappers, but Sherri Papini herself. And what they would soon uncover would shatter everything the world thought it knew. To the world, Sherri Papini was the picture of survival. A mother who had endured 22 days of terror and miraculously returned. But to law enforcement, something didn't feel right. The FBI was trained to listen beyond words, to read what wasn't said. In her initial interviews, Sherri's story was vague and riddled with inconsistencies. She described being taken by 2 Hispanic women, but when asked for details, her descriptions kept shifting. First, she said they wore masks the entire time. Then, she mentioned seeing facial features. One was young, one was older. Both spoke Spanish but barely talked to her. When pressed, she said she had gaps in her memory. Agents made note of every inconsistency. The location of her captivity was unknown. Sherri claimed she had been locked in a room with a boarded-up window, that she was let out to shower, that she was starved, burned, beaten. But forensic experts found her injuries inconsistent with prolonged abuse or captivity. The branding, a symbol seared onto her shoulder, was especially strange. It wasn't gang-related. It wasn't religious. It wasn't linked to any criminal group they knew. It felt personalized. But if she was a random victim, why would the captors go to such extremes? And why let her go? That too didn't make sense. In most abductions involving abuse or torture, the outcome is either escape, rescue, or, tragically, death. Sherri's story didn't follow any known pattern. She said they just let her go, dropped her off hours away, in the middle of nowhere. Agents filed that under highly unlikely. Behind the scenes, FBI profilers and behavioral analysts began looking into Sherri's past. Who was she before the jog? Before the cameras? Before Keith? They didn't have to look far to find red flags. There were whispers in her history, fabricated claims, attention-seeking behavior, and volatile relationships. Old friends came forward. An ex-boyfriend described her as manipulative. A former coworker claimed she lied about serious things, even faking illness. Another mentioned that Sherri once falsely accused her of abusing her. Piece by piece, a new image of Sherri Papini was taking shape, one that didn't match the victim the world had come to embrace. But the most damning evidence wouldn't come from an old friend. It would come from a tiny speck of DNA. Investigators had collected DNA from Sherri's clothing, specifically from her underwear and from her body, during the hospital exam. They ran the samples through the FBI's national database. The results came back negative. No matches. At least not yet. Then, in 2020, 4 years after her disappearance, there was a breakthrough. A partial match popped up in a genealogy database. It was connected to a man living in Costa Mesa, California. His name was James Reyes. He was Sherri's ex-boyfriend. The FBI knocked on Reyes' door. He was calm, cooperative, and then, just like that, he confessed. Sherri hadn't been kidnapped. She had run away voluntarily and stayed with him the entire time. The truth, as it turned out, was far stranger than fiction. James Reyes, the man whose DNA matched the samples found on Sherri Papini, hadn't seen her in years before 2016. But when FBI agents showed up at his door in Costa Mesa and began asking questions, he didn't hesitate. He admitted everything. Sherri had contacted him months before she disappeared, out of the blue. They had once dated in the early 2000s. After losing touch, she had reached out claiming she was being abused by her husband, Keith Papini. She told James she needed a safe place to stay, that she was terrified for her life. She painted herself as a victim of domestic violence, and James, still harboring feelings, agreed to help her. He thought he was saving her. So, on November 2nd, 2016, the day Sherri was kidnapped, she wasn't taken. She left voluntarily, texting James along a prearranged route. He drove hundreds of miles to Redding, picked her up near her home, and brought her to his small apartment in Southern California. They stayed there in relative quiet for the next 3 weeks. He never restrained her. He never hurt her. She had access to the internet, a bathroom, even went out in public once. When asked about her injuries, Reyes seemed genuinely stunned. She hurt herself, he said quietly. She'd hit herself. She starved herself. I saw her doing it. At one point, she even asked him to brand her, saying it would make the story more believable. Reyes, uncomfortable but compliant, used a wood-burning tool he had in the garage. He branded her right shoulder under her direction. It was then that he began to realize this wasn't about escape. This was about attention. She wasn't afraid of Keith. She missed the spotlight. And then, just as suddenly as she arrived, she told him she was ready to go back. She wanted to go home, she said. So James drove her north, dropped her near a freeway in Yolo County on Thanksgiving morning, and disappeared back into anonymity. He never expected the media storm. He never expected to be involved in a federal investigation. But now, with his DNA and his confession, the truth was undeniable. Sherri Papini had staged the entire thing. The FBI was stunned and deeply frustrated. They had spent countless hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars investigating a case that was now confirmed to be a hoax. But this wasn't just about wasting resources. It was about betrayal. Sherri had manipulated law enforcement, the media, her husband, and the public. And worst of all, she had done it while letting the nation believe 2 Hispanic women had abducted and tortured her. It was a narrative that stoked racial fears, fueled community paranoia, and painted innocent strangers with a brush of imagined cruelty. Local Hispanic women were questioned, looked at sideways. Some feared for their safety. Sherri had not just faked a kidnapping. She had weaponized a stereotype. Despite the mounting evidence, she refused to admit the truth. When confronted, she clung to the story. She claimed Reyes had tricked the FBI, that she was, in fact, abducted, and that Reyes was lying to cover something up. She doubled down on every lie, even as the DNA and timelines proved otherwise. Her husband, Keith, was devastated. For years, he had stood by her, crying on national television, raising their children alone, enduring whispers and speculation. And now, the woman he believed he had rescued had never needed rescuing at all. He filed for divorce shortly after the truth came out. In March 2022, Sherri Papini was arrested by federal agents. The charges: making false statements to federal law enforcement, mail fraud for accepting victim compensation benefits based on her fake abduction. The woman once seen as a symbol of survival was now a symbol of deception. March 3, 2022, more than 5 years after she vanished into supposed captivity, Sherri Papini was arrested outside her children's school by federal agents. The charges were clear. The evidence was overwhelming. And the world, once so sympathetic, watched in stunned silence. She had maintained her innocence until the very end. But now, in cold courtrooms and sealed interviews, the truth could no longer be dressed in fairy tales. The complaint filed by federal prosecutors was a meticulous timeline of deception. It detailed every lie, every falsified reimbursement form, every ounce of sympathy she had weaponized for personal gain. The U.S. Attorney's Office revealed that between 2017 and 2021, Sherri Papini had collected over $30,000 in victim compensation, claiming PTSD treatment, therapy, and lost wages, all based on a fabricated kidnapping. Meanwhile, her story had unraveled, not just legally but emotionally. The public turned swiftly. The same talk shows and news segments that once hailed her as a real-life survivor now dissected her manipulations. Social media was flooded with outrage, confusion, and betrayal. Why would someone do this? It wasn't a simple answer. Behind Sherri's carefully curated image of suburban perfection, the doting wife, the loving mother, there was something darker. Investigators, journalists, and psychologists speculated endlessly. Narcissistic tendencies? A craving for attention? A desire to escape the mundane? Or perhaps a need to feel something, even if it was false suffering. Sherri's ex-boyfriend, James Reyes, told agents he believed she was not well, emotionally unstable, dramatic, always playing the victim. Others echoed the sentiment. People from her past came forward with stories that painted a pattern. False accusations against family members, faked injuries, a manipulation of boyfriends, co-workers, even law enforcement. Keith Papini, once her fiercest defender, now stood broken. In court filings related to their divorce, he cited her actions as devastating to our family and children. He sought full custody and issued a heartbreaking public statement. The extent of her dishonesty and the lengths to which she went to trick us all is something I'll never fully understand. My priority now is protecting our children from this chaos. It was the collapse of a fantasy, the kind of fall that echoed across every media outlet. In April 2022, just weeks after her arrest, Sherri signed a plea deal. She admitted to staging the kidnapping, to staying with her ex, to injuring herself, to lying to the FBI, to taking money from the government meant for real victims of crime. In exchange for her guilty plea, prosecutors agreed to recommend a lighter sentence than the maximum possible. But public outrage made it clear, no matter the years handed down, her reputation would never recover. September 19, 2022, Sacramento, California. Inside the federal courthouse, the air was thick, not with anticipation, but with a strange cocktail of disbelief and disdain. The media lined the courthouse steps, reporters' microphones jostling for space. The crowd was smaller than the frenzy of 2016, but the intensity had only deepened. After years of lies, confusion, public mourning, and then fury, this was the day Sherri Papini would answer for what she had done. She entered the courtroom flanked by her attorneys. Her appearance was different, more subdued, less radiant than the photos the media had once circulated. Her shoulders slumped, eyes darting, jaw clenched. She wasn't here as a victim. She was here as a convicted liar. Federal prosecutors didn't mince words. They laid out the ripple effect of her actions. How she misled the nation, wasted enormous public resources, tarnished the credibility of real victims, and traumatized her own children, who had believed their mother was tortured by strangers. And perhaps most damaging, how she weaponized ethnicity, fabricating a story about two Hispanic women as her captors. A lie that sowed seeds of racial bias and distrust in her community. Papini not only committed a calculated fraud, one prosecutor said, she did so at the expense of her family, the public, and our entire justice system. It was not a mistake. It was a manipulation. Then came the victims' impact statements. Keith Papini submitted a letter. He chose not to be in the courtroom, protecting his children from further emotional trauma. What she did broke me. I devoted myself to her, to protecting her, to loving her. I raised our children in her absence. I suffered publicly, and I suffered quietly. I don't even know who I was married to. A moment of silence followed the reading. Then the judge turned to Sherri. She stood. Her voice was quiet, shaky, rehearsed. I'm so sorry. I am guilty of lying. I am guilty of dishonor. I tried to escape reality, and I made selfish decisions that hurt everyone I loved, especially my children. I regret every moment of it. Her statement lacked tears. The remorse, some said, felt clinical. The judge, unmoved by her apology, delivered the sentence. 18 months in federal prison, 36 months of supervised probation, and restitution of over $300,000 to law enforcement and the California Victim Compensation Board. It was a stiff sentence for a nonviolent offense, but the judge made it clear. This wasn't just punishment for one woman. It was a message. You've damaged public trust. You've made it harder for real victims to be believed. And you did it all for attention. This court must respond accordingly. Sherri Papini was led out of the courtroom in silence. The woman once painted as a resilient survivor, the face of tragedy and hope, was now a cautionary tale. The gavel had fallen. Sherri Papini was no longer a missing mother or a brave survivor. She was a convicted fraud. As news of her sentencing broke across major headlines, it reignited a wave of public anger, not only over her actions but over the collateral damage left in her wake. Keith Papini quietly finalized his divorce and was granted sole custody of their two children. He changed the locks on the house that once held family memories and tried, piece by piece, to reclaim a sense of normalcy for their kids. But normal was a moving target. Their son and daughter had grown up with the belief that their mother had been abducted, beaten, and branded. They had drawn her welcome home cards. They had cried for her in the dead of night. And now they were being told gently, carefully, that none of it had been real. They were victims too. Keith's statement to the court had only scratched the surface. In private, he confided in friends that the betrayal was suffocating. She stole more than time. She stole our trust, our truth, our future. He tried to shield the kids from the media, pulling them out of school temporarily, limiting internet access. But there was no outrunning the headlines. Sherri Papini had become a symbol of deception, a name that evoked shame, manipulation, and a story that read more like a psychological thriller than real life. In Redding, the small city where it all began, the scars lingered. Many residents had joined in the search. Some had donated money, others meals, time, prayers. They had made ribbons, lit candles, hugged strangers. The disappearance had united them in a shared fear and a shared hope. To learn it was all a hoax left a bitter taste. The Hispanic community, in particular, felt violated. Sherri's fictional account of two Hispanic women as her abductors stoked dangerous stereotypes, and for weeks, women who vaguely fit the description were viewed with suspicion. Some even reported being stopped by strangers or followed in parking lots. She didn't just lie, one community organizer said. She weaponized race. And for what? Sympathy? Tension? Could have gotten someone hurt. Nationally, the Papini case became a benchmark of mistrust. Social media users coined it the Gone Girl hoax, referencing the fictional tale of a staged disappearance. But this wasn't fiction. This was real, and it carried consequences for real victims of abduction and abuse. Advocates worried that Sherri's actions would undermine belief in future cases. Would the next missing woman be doubted? Would police hesitate, fearing another hoax? Sherri's case became a cautionary tale in law enforcement training programs, a case study in media manipulation, and a psychological discussion in college ethics classes. In prison, Sherri Papini kept to herself. Inmates and staff reported her as quiet, sometimes tearful, occasionally reading religious texts. Some claimed she maintained that she had simply broken under pressure. Others said she still tried to twist her story, minimizing her guilt, maximizing her pain. But outside, the world moved on without her. There were no more interviews, no more tears on morning shows. The nation that once rallied around her had turned the page. And as the months passed, so did the memory of her hoax, fading slightly, but never disappearing completely. Why did we believe her? Why did so many people, law enforcement, media outlets, her husband, her community, fall for a story that, in hindsight, had so many red flags? The answer lies not just in what Sherri said, but in how she said it, and in the emotional terrain she knew how to navigate so well. Sherri Papini fit the mold that media and the public instinctively rally behind. A young, attractive white mother, living in a quiet, safe community. A suddenly missing without a trace. A family man husband desperate for answers. Children left behind. It was in every way the perfect storm. Psychologists refer to this as the missing white woman syndrome. The media's tendency to give disproportionate coverage to certain victims, particularly white, middle-class women. Sherri's story played directly into that bias, whether intentional or not. But it wasn't just the media. The public, too, wants a story they can connect to emotionally. A story with a villain, a victim, and a hopeful ending. Sherri gave them that. A woman kidnapped, a husband heartbroken, a family reunited, a mystery still unsolved. It was suspenseful, cinematic, and too good not to believe. From the moment she was found, bruised, emaciated, shackled, people wanted to believe her. And when people want to believe something, they look for evidence that confirms it and ignore the parts that don't fit. The inconsistencies in her timeline? She must be traumatized. The vague description of her captors? They probably wore masks. The lack of forensic evidence in the SUV? They were professionals. The mind filled in the blanks. The narrative was too compelling. The pain too real. It wasn't until hard evidence, DNA, phone records, confessions, shattered the illusion that the scales began to fall. But there was another layer, Sherri herself. She had long played the role of the damsel in distress. Friends and family recalled patterns, past accusations, emotional manipulation, and stories that bent to suit her needs. It was as though being a victim gave her control in situations where she otherwise felt invisible. And in 2016, that impulse collided with a cultural moment obsessed with true crime, media sympathy, and the viral power of victimhood. She wasn't just surviving the spotlight, she was feeding off it. She wanted to be remembered, one former friend said, and she was willing to risk everything to make sure she was. In believing her, the world didn't just lose money and time, it lost trust. Trust in missing persons reports. Trust in emotional testimonies. Trust in victims who genuinely needed help. Even now, years later, her name is brought up in caution. Is this another Sherri Papini situation? She became the reference point for fraud, the measuring stick for skepticism. And that, perhaps, is the darkest twist of all, that her story didn't just hurt those closest to her. It cast a shadow over every woman who might come forward in the future with a story that is real, but unbelievable. In the end, it wasn't the bruises or the bindings. It wasn't the story of masked captors or haunting screams in the night. It was the truth, buried beneath layers of manipulation, that finally caught up with Sherri Papini. But the truth didn't come cleanly, came shattered, fractured, slowly revealed over years. And by the time it surfaced, it had already done damage that couldn't be undone. The Papini case wasn't just a personal tragedy. It became a case study in how lies ripple outward. It damaged a husband who had to reconcile love with betrayal. It affected two children who had to relearn who their mother really was. It disrupted the lives of innocent people, including a marginalized community falsely accused. And it diverted thousands of hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars away from real emergencies. Real people who were hurting. The lie was not just a deception. It was a theft. It stole time. It stole trust. It stole attention from voices that were truly silenced. Sherri's story proved something uncomfortable. Truth is fragile when emotions are strong. In a world where narratives spread like wildfire, where breaking news moves faster than fact-checkers, one woman's falsehood became a national crisis. Because it fit a narrative and we wanted to believe it. Because in Sherri's lie, there were so many appealing beats. The beautiful mother gone without a trace. The loyal husband fighting for her. The terrifying captivity. The miraculous return. It was a story built for headlines. Built for clicks. Built for Netflix. And maybe that's why it worked. In the aftermath, Sherri Papini began serving her sentence. Keith rebuilt his life slowly, privately. Their children, now older, live with the knowledge that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. And the country, briefly captivated by a woman who cried wolf, moved on. But the echo of her story lingers. Her name is still searched. Her mugshot still circulates. And when new missing person cases surface, her story is often referenced. A lingering what if that hangs over the real ones. Sherri Papini vanished in 2016. But what really disappeared was our certainty, the ability to know for sure who is telling the truth and who is playing a role.